Good morning and welcome to Empower Innovations Tech Talk, a pandemic response. I am your moderator, LaSharn Dozier. First, I'd like to thank everyone that has continued with us from our earlier sessions. And again, I welcome those who are just coming in to join us now. As we move through today's session, I encourage and remind those attendees that are joining us through our interactive platform to submit your questions in our session Q&A area, and we'll be sure to get to those questions before the session ends. In today's 30-minute Tech Talk, we are pleased to have Avi Sinha from Deloitte Consulting with us today. Avi has many accomplishments in digital transformations and analytics focused on regulatory issues, and he also serves as a lead in multiple areas in Deloitte, including a principal in the strategy and analytics practice and the lead client service partner for financial regulators. Avi, welcome. It's great to have you join us today.
Wonderful. I'll say thank you, LaSharn, and hello, everyone. So, in early March, like many of you, I started working from home. And if you remember, it happened pretty quickly. It happened quickly for me. And I wanted to make sure that, I'd have as minimum a disruption as possible, right? So I set up my desk at home and I will wake up in the morning. I will come to my desk, my new office. I will keep my schedule very similar, work, on my conference calls, on my Zoom meetings, reading, writing, and I end my day, let's say around 5:30 or 6 o'clock. And I felt, it felt like a normal work day, even if I was working from home. So a couple of months passed by, right? And around Memorial Day, I realized, something was really off. I was sleeping less, I was working longer hours, clearly not exercising, given the gyms are closed. And, I also found out that my personal and my professional life was intersecting, asking some really new questions. Like, for example, who is going to prepare lunch on a weekday, given me and my wife both are working parents? So, and I'm a data geek. So what it means is I track everything, right? I track my steps, my resting heart rate, my sleep scores. Those of you, in the audience who use Fitbit, you know exactly what I mean, right? And so they were all trending downwards, needless to say. So I needed an intervention. So I took a step back. I rethought how I work. I changed my structure to have multiple blocks instead of one. I inserted, time for preparing lunch. I started exercising in the middle of the day. I put like 10 minutes in my calendar to do meditation using my favorite apps like a Headspace or a Calm. And fast forward a couple of months, this is my resting heart rate, right? And as you can see, it was trending up and it started trending down. And honestly, this is quite a reflection of my overall wellness, and my other metrics, as I mentioned, sort of correlate with my resting heart rate here. The moral of the story is that, while I started working in a new normal, as a result of working from home, I did not take the time to reimagine my work. And I had to take a step back to change my habits, change my norms, to get to a place, where I have the right kind of work-life balance, so that I can be more functional. At the same time, I have all the other things that matter to me. So as it turns out, like just like me, organizations and industries also have habits, beliefs, and practices, and that's what you call orthodoxies. So what are orthodoxies? I mean, these are pervasive beliefs, that go unstated, they're unchallenged. They shape behavior, choices, strategy, creates blind spots. And it is important to challenge orthodoxies, because only when you challenge orthodoxies, you can think about unconventional solutions to the problems that you have. And when you think about some of the companies, that I've just put in the picture there, Netflix or Airbnb and Uber, they have essentially, disrupted entire industries by challenging orthodoxies. Just imagine like a decade from now, or decade before now, who would have thought, you or I could go to a new city, take a ride with a stranger, right, go from point A to point B and actually feel safe. That's the story of Uber. What is interesting is that in the middle of the pandemic, organizations around the world, and I'll focus on governments a little bit today, right? Governments around the world are truly breaking orthodoxies and creating innovations using technology. And my belief is that this is going to last way beyond this pandemic. So let's orient ourselves into a couple of things, right? So I have like 10 orthodoxies on this page, right, which governments around the world are challenging and flipping. So it's in three categories. You've got workforce, you've got service delivery, you've got pace, meaning speed. And just to get a little bit of intuition, let's read out a few of them. Line of sight supervision is essentially the orthodoxy pre-COVID. And I would say the flip to that is telecommunicating becomes a norm and in-office meetings is an exception. In a service delivery category, let's look at, randomly number 6. Orthodoxy number 6 is most government services must be delivered in person. And I would argue that the flip is very few services actually require in-person delivery. And then in terms of pace or speed, orthodoxy number 9, regulation is a lengthy and inflexible process. And I would argue the flip is regulation is agile and adaptive. Now you're going to ask me that, Avi, that sounds great on paper, but is it really happening? So why don't I do this? Take a little bit of time to, go through some examples, do a deep dive, so you can see, what is happening around the world. So let's pick at orthodoxy number 3. Recruiting and hiring employees is a lengthy and in-person process. And quite frankly, in government around the world, hiring does involve in-person interviews. It involves subjective assessments. There's a compliance to the processes. And I would say that, the speed is not necessarily the hallmark of that process, right? And around the world, governments are relaxing, at least some authorities, to bypass the lengthy process, especially around COVID-related work. A great example of taking advantage of that is from US Department of Agriculture. So USDA in the height of the pandemic, so think about, late April, early May, they had some critical needs around accountants, economists, geographers, grant specialists. They quickly partnered with the University of Missouri to create a virtual career expo. And not only they were able to, source a lot of qualified candidates, actually get them board really, really quickly. So you can imagine that some things like virtual career expo is here to stay. The same USDA, a different department, it is called the Food Inspection and Safety Service. They have been investing in virtual reality, for the last couple of years. And this is to transform your classroom experience. You think about veterinarians, you think about inspectors, into a VR model, which gives you a lot more experiential experience. You get to see, how the work really looks like. And these are complicated work, right? You're literally going to, let's say, a slaughter plant and inspecting if things are okay. And who knew that this kind of capability is actually going to help you with recruiting? So what the Food Inspection Safety Service has done is that for new candidates, who wants to potentially take a job in the area of inspection, veterinary science, they will give those recruits, a VR capability so they can actually visualize how the work really looks like in the work environment. And you can imagine that the work is not easy. I mean, it does involve, cutting meat at times, et cetera. And interestingly, about a quarter or 20 to 25% of the folks who apply for the jobs, once they see the reality of it, they choose not to join. And that's great news for USDA because you are able to recruit folks, who are very committed. You are not spending the time in training folks and perhaps even relocating. And after that, once they see the work, they may or may not stay. But in addition to that, once they're on board, the VR games is actually helping them get trained, in event of, going for an inspection, and especially relevant in a COVID environment. So that's the story of VR. The next orthodoxy I'm going to touch on is orthodoxy number 5. A personalized customer experience requires a human touch. Now, a human touch is important. When you think about, a smiling face, a helping hand, non-verbal cues. I mean, these are hallmark of customer experience, right? And I would argue that new orthodoxy is digital technology can provide more accessible and personalized service. Now you may ask, Avi, does that really work? It does. It does if it is hassle-free, if it is simple, it is very intuitive, it's data-driven, it is human-centric, it's highly possible. A great example during the pandemic I saw was from the Spanish government. So Spanish Health Service, they created something called HISP about COVID-19. It is a conversational agent, obviously powered by artificial intelligence. And to get to the last mile, to give that experience, what they did was they integrated this intelligent agent, with a very popular messaging platform, called WhatsApp, which is very popular in Spain. And all you need to do is that, plug in that number on WhatsApp and just say hello, and you can initiate a conversation. And what that does is that, if you have any questions related to symptoms, what's happening in your neighborhood, health updates, emergency numbers, you can simply get it, through your WhatsApp integrated intelligent agent. It not only saved tons of visits, to any of the offices, but more importantly, moved folks away from taking scarce resources like, telephone calls, to make sure that that can be directed towards more emergency needs. So that's a great example of digital technology that can be more accessible and more personalized. The next example on the similar vein is that of Smart Start. And I love Smart Start because it truly gives you an experience. I mean, it is not a transaction. It is not giving a piece of information. So what Smart Start is that in New Zealand, when you are expecting a child and the first year of the baby, I mean, these are like stressful times. And many of you have gone through it. So did I, right? I mean, these are times when you don't know many things, you want to gather more information, etc. So what New Zealand does is that you register that you're planning to have a baby, or it's during pregnancy, and they really help you through the whole process, meaning where to go for prenatal care, right? What kind of child seats to buy, when the child is born, establishing a digital identity, so that you do not have to go to a government office necessarily and pay, let's say, $30 to actually get a physical birth certificate. And in New Zealand, this is one of the very popular apps, that saves parents and expecting parents, thousands and thousands of hours, going to government offices. So great example, where digital services can actually be better than human touch. The next orthodoxy is orthodoxy number 6. Most government services must be delivered in person. And quite frankly, when you think about certain services like DMV tests, court proceedings, inspections, social work home visits, I mean, they have been always been conducted in person. And with COVID, I mean, these services needs to be as contactless as possible. So it is hard. And so let's talk about virtual courts for a moment. So UK in 2016, they initiated a pilot program to digitize, the judicial processes. They did not scale it at that point. As a result of COVID, they have scaled the whole approach, which is not only having video and teleconferencing, but other digital enabling capabilities. And now, cases are being heard all the way up to the high court, using a virtual setting. It's very successful and very relevant in a COVID environment. From an e-court perspective, I mean, Estonia is probably the most advanced. They have gone further, right? They have not only digitized the processes like UK, but they have also taken the legal documents, put AI algorithms on top of it, and it can pronounce, decisions of small disputes. For example, something that's less than 7,000 euros. And as a result of that, when you think about Estonia, they are probably the most advanced e-court system. They are 32% faster than the rest of Europe. They can handle double the caseload with the same number of judges in last couple of decades. It's a great story of like non-conventional things that you'll expect to be more delivered in person being done in a more digital way. What about DMV? So this was very interesting. I mean, I just came across this a couple of months ago. A province in India, they have piloted a program to do the DMV driving tests in a virtual setting. So you might ask, how does that work? So a driving test, if you recall, I mean, typically you'll have instructor sitting next to you. You'll traverse through, the driving track. You will eventually get a pass or a fail depending on what you did. So in this instance, you do not have an instructor. What you have is in front of you, in front of the driver, you have a smartphone and an app. And what it does is that it records all sorts of things like the speed, did you stop at a stoplight? Did your eye movements, did you see left and right, before making a turn? How you navigate a roundabout, do your parallel parking, etc. And then it can help you with eventually, whether you passed or failed. So great example of like incredible innovation, right? during the time of pandemic. And again, like I do believe that some of these things are going to scale, even after the pandemic is over. So I'll go to the next orthodoxy, which is orthodoxy number 7. A physical presence is needed to authenticate identity. And in particular in the United States, I mean, as you all know, right, the identity, the authentication identity is a patchwork of systems, right? Complicated processes. It's kind of a barrier when you think about interagency collaboration in many ways too. And with COVID-19 social distancing guidelines, I mean, we need an alternative to physical identity management, right? One of the best examples, that I've seen, and quite frankly, this is not just related to COVID. It happened before COVID, but used during COVID, is the Aadhaar program in India. What India has done is for the 1.3 billion folks that live in India, they have created a digital passport, which essentially has your biometric information, your demographic information, and it was extremely handy during COVID-19 because they had to disburse COVID cash to 40 million beneficiaries, and it was incredibly efficient to do that, with a digital passport. And we are seeing a trend across government in driving in that direction. Like South Korea, they are accelerating the migration to digital identification, electronic certificates. They are also collaborating with telecom companies to create apps, that can make it even simpler. And this is not one-off. Like, this is a chart that shows, the kind of major initiatives that is happening in government across the world. And quite frankly, this is not quite as exhaustive either. So the pace of movement in that area across the world is pretty significant. So orthodoxy number 8, right? The governments manage demand for services reactively. Now, reactive is not a negative word, right? What it means is that a citizen, is asking for a service, and government provides a service. In some ways, you request and you get, that's being reactive, right? The argument for me is that new orthodoxy is that governments anticipate citizens' needs. You don't have to ask for it, and government will anticipate it. And during COVID-19, we are seeing some really, really good examples of that. So soon after COVID-19 outbreak, South Korea, like most governments across the world, they ramped up supply of masks, PPEs, and many other things that is needed for healthcare workers, for citizens, etc. But they did not stop there. What they did was they also created apps by which you can see, where these supplies are available in a nearby location, because they anticipated, that is going to be the next step, not only for citizens, but also for emergency workers. So anyway, that's a great story of anticipating citizens' needs and government becoming what I call anticipatory government. This is a nice quote by Martin Kavets. He is the National Digital Advisor of Estonia. And he says, the best service is something that you even didn't notice you got. So in other words, you become really invisible while giving the service. So a great example of that I found in Austria. So in Austria, when a child is born, you literally, the information of the child, moves from the hospital to the central civil registry. It goes to Ministry of Finance. It goes to the local tax offices. In Austria, they disburse allowances for new kids, and they automatically disburse these allowances. So in other words, there is no touch. Government is almost invisible. Citizens are not asking for it. They simply receive the service. It's a great example of that. So hopefully, some of these examples in terms of orthodoxies that's been broken and examples give you some inspiration in terms of your own work as you think about, what orthodoxies that you can break using technology and create like net new innovation. So I will switch a little bit and talk a little bit about regulatory environment. Clearly, this is not a discussion to talk about future regulation. That's probably for another discussion. But I did want to touch upon, what I call regulators toolkit. So broadly speaking, regulators and financial regulators included, the challenges are significant. And we heard some of that, when we heard the chairman speak and the interview that Joanne did earlier in the segment. The significant challenges, the significant innovation that is happening in its industry. It is hard to keep pace. And even the core of the work, like keeping compliance, looking at fraud, and protecting consumers, is increasingly hard. Now, in some ways, the arc of technology, right, supporting the regulators, it has been there pre-COVID. I mean, this is not necessarily a function of pandemic. So, for example, if you look at the right side of my chart, robotics, process automation, or artificial intelligence, or augmented reality, or blockchain, the trend lines on these technologies had been there, pre-COVID. But what I would like to highlight is the application of these technologies in a regulatory environment is getting more important than ever. Chairman did touch upon a few of those examples in his conversation, but let me give an example, like even a benign process, right? Meaning when you're doing rule making, you are getting comments from the industry. I mean, it's a very benign process. Not the rule making itself is complicated, but getting feedback itself is benign. Uh, a couple of years ago, when FCC was getting feedback from the industry around net neutrality, they received 22 million comments. And believe it or not, a million of the comments were actually generated by bots trying to prop up a particular point of view. So these kind of threats are real, and these things cannot be solved humanly. I mean, unless you're able to apply some of the technologies that you have in the right. So FCC in this instance, they've literally created a relatively sophisticated set of processes and technologies using AI to make sure they can combat some of these issues down the road. But this is just one illustrative example. There are a ton of those things happening in and around the regulations. Now, there are also business tools, right? Like some of the ones that I love are sandboxes, crowdsourcing, clearly customer experience, and nudging. I'll not touch on them all, but maybe a couple. So regulatory sandboxes is something that has come into prominence in the last few years. It is happening across industries. It is pretty prevalent in fintech. And those of you who may not be familiar with the regulatory sandbox, all that means is that in a very controlled environment, you are relaxing certain regulations and really trying to understand the impact of relaxation so that you can eventually scale it. The flip side of that is you are fostering innovation. Like I think Chairman talked a little bit about like how to keep the competitive innovation in the United States. And part of it is that helping some unconventional startups, let's say, coming with some new technologies, new business models, really getting tested in a sandbox type environment, before that can be scaled, and you're relaxing certain kind of regulations. So let me give you an example to just illustrate the point. So the Canadian Securities Agency, right, they have a fintech sandbox. There is a company called Impact Finance, and this was the very first company in North America who was able to raise $1 million in cryptocurrency crowd sale. And they were able to do that because they're in the CSA's regulatory sandbox. They relaxed the rule sets. They did not have to register as a dealer. They did not have to furnish a prospectus. And they will continue to stay in the sandbox for next couple of years for CSA to really collaborate on this, understand what the implications are, eventually help what should be the rights, rules, and regulations for the future. The place where I've seen they're more advanced in terms of regulatory sandboxes in the fintech arena is probably the Financial Conduct Board that's in UK, Financial Conduct Agency, I should say, FCA in UK. They have collaborated with multiple regulatory agencies. They have now, I think, fifth or sixth cohort of entities in that sandbox, and very similar construct, right? That you have business models, technologies, innovations that's happening in the industry. You're grappling with what those regulations could be, and in a mutually collaborative way, you are putting some of these in a sandbox. So you're sort of in the watchful eye of the regulator, but at the same time, you're understanding what the implications are, if you relax some of those rules or perhaps add more constraints. So these are usually very time bound, for maybe a year or a couple of years, but this has been very effective. So that's something in the regulator's toolkit. The other thing, the regulator's toolkit that I love is the idea of crowdsourcing. I mean, innovation is hard. I mean, things are happening across the world at a very rapid pace. So it does make sense that, you involve the industry in identifying and probably scaling some new ideas. And the contours of crowdsourcing are very similar, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you're identifying a challenge, you're inviting the industry, and at the end goal is that the participants get a prize or perhaps recognition, and whoever is starting the crowdsourcing initiative you either get a new piece of innovation or possibly fail fast, right? A good example of that in the U.S. financial regulatory spaces of that of FDIC. Some of you might have seen it. They are doing a industry innovation challenge to identify early risks, and they've invited a whole suite of fintech organizations, technology companies from Silicon Valley, and some system integrators to really look at that challenge, come up with a prototype, right? And possibly see some new ways of doing the way we think about examination. So those are some examples in the toolkit. I did leave a write-up on Regulators Toolkit with the moderating team, so hopefully you might find it useful. But I think what I would really want to highlight is that these are all the things that you have in your toolkit, and the question is that how do you apply that toolkit? So on the application side, just a couple thoughts. One being that in your own organization, think about zooming in and zooming out. So when you zoom in, you see a lot of potential in terms of automation, in terms of realizing efficiencies. These are less complicated. These are potentially in a span of control, so it becomes easier to execute. An example could be that, let's say you're moving towards virtual exam as a result of COVID. What are the processes that I need to automate to make that happen? That's zooming in. But I would also ask to zoom out. When you zoom out, then you see a very different picture. You can reimagine jobs, you can reconstruct work, you can enhance machine-human collaboration. Just imagine for a moment, that if, and I believe that it's not if, it's a matter of when you use artificial intelligence in a significant way, why wouldn't you think about a job role that says that he or she is an algorithm auditor? I mean, those are the kind of things you can think about, when you zoom out. And candidly, I would say that while some of these discussions seems interesting and the case studies can be inspiring, I know how hard it is. And the hardest part is the human element. Just from my example, right? When I, moved from, working in an office setting to a home setting, it took me like 2 months to recognize something was off, right? It took me another 2 months to do something about it. And when you think about an organization or even an ecosystem, it's highly magnified. So anytime we are thinking about innovation, we are thinking about breaking orthodoxies, we are thinking about using technology to disrupt, the human side is extremely important. So do think about that. And maybe I'll leave with that note that it's a quote from a great innovator of the United States, Charles Kettering. People are open-minded about new things as long as they are exactly like the old ones. So just keep that in mind, as you're thinking about disruption and innovation or breaking orthodoxies. So with that, LaSharn, I'll pause here. I'll hand it back to you, and happy to take any questions.
So, Avi, thank you so much. This was an absolutely wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. It was really, really great. It was. I have to say that there were those points where you could see the transition points and our own introspections in life, in government and business and technology, and how we adjust and how we respond to those transition points. And and as you said, how it takes so much time, but then it takes so much time to realize that there is a change, and then there is also that maybe that same amount of time where we have to say, okay, well, now I have to make a change now that there is a change to establish my new norm. So we do have a question. Our question is, have you seen examples in the US of digital identity or digital services you mentioned other countries have? And what challenges do you see the US has in incorporating such technology?
That's a very good question. And I'll flip the question a little differently because, I'm a strategy practitioner, right? And for me, I try to figure out how to solve it. And here is how we'll flip it. Whenever I have a question like this, I reverse engineer it, meaning what needs to be true for this to happen, right? So if you flip the question that way, you will see a number of things, right? Clearly, there are questions about who owns the idea of digital identity in government, and that's a very interesting question, right? I don't think I have an answer for it, but that is a legitimate question to think about. I mean, is it something that regulators would like to create on their own for their own benefit in a partnership? Is it a government-wide Is it with state and local governments? And these are very interesting questions on ownership. I think the technology is not hard because technology is available. Technology has been implemented. I think there are some very good standards that NIST has put together. I think the real question becomes that what is the ownership and what's the propagation mechanism? And I think that's the question that we'll need to ask. So I don't have a specific advice on how to going about doing it. And quite frankly, many of these challenges has been hard. And it does require some degree of, let's call it sponsorship, right? And if you're talking about an organization, you're talking about sponsorship within an organization, but this is cross-cutting, cross-government. So sponsorship potentially might even need to come from, let's say, the leader of the executive branch or perhaps from the Congress. So the potential is there. But nevertheless, I think that is probably the hardest part in solving that problem in the United States compared to the technology that is needed to solve that problem.
That's a very interesting point. I noticed one of the other things just kind of related to that in your presentation, I believe it was Orthodoxy number 9, where, government essentially, that the regulatory process is not so long. We have to be a little more adaptive and a little more agile. And that's one of the things that our chairman was saying in his fireside chat earlier this morning. And then you follow in and say, state the same point in our tech talk here. So it's one of those things that, as we become more agile, we become more adaptive and moving and, trying to find out how we change and how we respond in these areas of technology and regulation and business and life. It's really interesting just to see, again, how everyone, how everyone has that balance. But then also, I think it's really interesting to know, just to understand, how are people doing this around the globe? So there are very good points there.
Yeah, and LaSharn, if I may add to that, I think the regulators toolkit that I mentioned, there are many methods and techniques that can be applied, but I think Chairman talked about it in his fireside chat as well. Part of it is about trust, and the flip side of orthodoxy is beliefs, and beliefs. Let's take a hypothetical, but possibly a close example is that if our belief is that we are here to protect consumers, right? I think this needs to come out very loud and clear. And therefore, when you're doing something like a regulatory sandbox, it doesn't feel like, or people do not believe that this is basically favoring a company X, but it is more about, making the regulations a lot more nimble and a lot more adaptable, than being rigid. So I think that's the flip side of it, of orthodoxy, which is about beliefs, and projecting those beliefs in a realistic way is extremely important, in my opinion.
Very good. Very good. Well, again, thank you for your time today. We're very pleased to have you there. We appreciate all of the information that you've shared with us. For our attendees, Avi's presentation will be in our documents area within our interactive platform, along with the additional resources. Again, we encourage you to submit your questions into our session Q&A as we move along in the session. We are going to now transition to our panel talk discussion in a moment. So we will be right back in a moment. Thank you again. Thanks, Avi.
Thank you.